Welcome back. In this video we're going to look at the dash and the colon as elements in sentence structure. Now, as we know, there are many techniques in sentence structure and we need to be a little bit careful because sentence structure is an umbrella term. The question will ask us to talk about sentence structure, but we have to pick which technique we choose. Now, onto the single dash or the colon. Most importantly, I suppose, to begin with is you need to be able to recognize these, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but you need to be able to see that the one on the left is a dash and the one on the right that looks like two full stops, one on top of each other, is a colon. When you answer a question on the dash or the colon, you'll use this structure. The writer uses a dash 2 or the writer uses a colon 2. This is what the dash looks like. Now, I like to think of the dash as a bit like a full stop. So here's our dash, and we know a lot more about our full stop because we use them every day in our sentences. You may not have written a dash in one of your sentences before, or very rarely. The full stop is an ending, a very firm ending to a sentence. I like to think of it as a closed door, right? There's nothing going through that door, okay? And there's no letterbox, there's no way any information is passing through that door. But the dash, on the other hand, is like a door that's been left ajar a little bit. There's space. There's the opportunity to add just a little bit extra information before the door closes. And actually, if you look at the shape of the dash, I like to think of it as almost like a letterbox. And a letterbox is a way of getting information through a closed door. So this is how I've always remembered a dash, and I think you might find it useful too. So remember the shape of the letterbox, that kind of rectangular shape. And when you get one of those, you get a dash. Here's another door, another letterbox, just to remind us. It's that way that we can sneak extra information through. And the shape. So here's an example of a magazine or a leaflet being put through a letterbox. Here's a clear example, a newspaper being put through a letterbox. And use that to help you remember what a dash can do. So let's have a look. This is our dash. Looks like a letterbox. We know it can get extra information through. So we need to look at some examples. Oops. So here is an example with a full stop. There's no dash in this sentence. The woman closed her eyes at the top of the Eiffel Tower. Full stop. That full stop is like a closed door. Okay, there's no more information. However, what if the writer wanted to let us know a little bit more about why the woman was closing her eyes? Well, the writer could add in a dash and say she was scared of heights. That's that idea of just adding in a little bit extra information. And if we were to try and answer a question on this sentence, once we'd seen the dash, we need to talk about what comes after the dash in our answer. So it would look something like this. So first of all, there's what comes after the dash, highlighted. And for 1 mark, we would say the writer uses a dash in line 2 to add. And we got 1 mark for identifying the sentence structure technique, the dash. And in this case, it adds an explanation of why she closed her eyes. Because she was afraid of being on top of tall buildings. And that will get us our 2nd mark. Okay, let's look at a second example with a dash. The First Minister's message is clear. Ignoring climate change is not an option. Now, in this case, you would be scanning through and you would see that single dash. Remember, if it's 2 dashes, you'd be thinking parenthesis. But you see a single dash there. And your job is to see what is the extra information. Once you find the dash, don't focus too much on that piece of punctuation, that symbol. Look at what comes after the dash. And in this case, we get the phrase, ignoring climate change is not an option. Okay? So in a question, or when we're answering a question in a prelim or in an SQA exam, we need to focus on the bit in red. We need to explain that. And I tend to try to use my own words as much as possible to show that I understand it. So it would look something like this. The writer uses a dash in line 2 to explain what the First Minister's message is. And then the last sentence in the answer, I use my own words. Okay? She isn't going to turn a blind eye to or disregard global warming. Okay, so I've changed climate change to global warming, and I've changed the word ignore as well. So I would get 1 mark for the first bit where I said dash, and I would get a 2nd mark for where I've added my explanation using my own words. And that's essentially what a dash does. It adds extra information. It pushes the door open ajar rather than closing it off the way a full stop does. Okay, let's look at the colon. Now, again, just take a moment to look at it so that you can recognize it. I like to think of it as just 2 full stops. it does essentially the same job as the dash. It just keeps that full stop door open a little bit more. It allows you to add extra information in. And sometimes with a colon, that extra information is a list. Sometimes it's an explanation like we saw with the dash. And again, it's just squeezing extra information into a sentence. So let's look at this example. Here's a sentence without a colon. It's actually two sentences. I'd be too afraid to step outside in Australia. There are dangers lurking everywhere. Now, full stop at the end of that last sentence. That's the door closed. However, I could add extra information if I wanted to make sure the reader understood what I was talking about. What if the reader doesn't know what dangers I'm talking about? So I change the full stop to a colon and add in an explanation. Poisonous spiders, venomous snakes and lethal sharks. And in this case, it's actually a short list of 3 items. So just so you can see it more clearly, there's the extra information being squeezed in that picture. I've made the colon much bigger, made it bold, and I've put the extra information, the list, in red. So how would this look like in an answer? How would I explain it? Well, first I just have to mention that I've seen the colon. So the writer uses a colon in line 3. That gets me 1 mark straight away. And the second mark is, can I explain what came afterwards? And in this case, it's to introduce a list of deadly animals. So I didn't reuse the same words, I've used my own words. To introduce a list of deadly animals that can kill you in Australia. She does this to explain why she is scared. Now, I could have said that it was a list. The writer uses a list because it's true. If we go back up here, we can see that that is a list. The SQA won't mind whether you choose list or whether you choose colon in this case, because it's basically 2 techniques. The colon is introducing the list, so you can talk about either. You can mention the colon first or the list. It makes no difference. Okay, so here's what our answer looks like, and we'll look at a second example now. By the end of the conference, the Prime Minister's plan was clear to everyone. Divide and conquer. Now in this case, as you can see, I've put the colon in straight away. It's in the 3rd line there. I could have put a full stop there and left off the divide and conquer. But my job now in the exam is to explain the function of that phrase divide and conquer, because that's the bit that's been squeezed in. That's the bit that's coming after the natural full stop. So using my own words, I've identified it there, using my own words as much as possible. I mention that it's a colon, 1 mark straight away, just for seeing that it's a colon. And then I say what that divide and conquer phrase means. So to explain what the Prime Minister's plot was, he intended to beat his enemies by splitting, that's divide, by splitting them into smaller groups. Okay, and beat his enemies is the idea of conquering. So I get 1 mark for colon and 1 mark for my explanation. That's basically it for a single dash or a colon. Think of it as squeezing information past a full stop. Think of it as a letterbox in a door. Think of it as a magazine or a newspaper being squeezed through a letterbox. A little bit of extra information being added onto a sentence. When you're answering a question, once you've identified it, once you've named it's a dash, or once you've named that it's a colon, you must move on to what comes after the colon. That's where the real answer lies. The real answer lies in the bit that comes after those symbols, the explanation, the list, the added information. So that's what you focus on for the second mark, for the second part of your answer. And this is basically the formula. Identify the symbol for 1 mark, is it a dash or a colon? And then analyse what comes after the symbol. Right? I've capitalized that word after because it's so important. I think that's where people lose lots of marks. They don't really know what the colon's doing. They can see it, or the dash, and they name it and they get a mark, but then their explanation kind of loses power, loses energy, because the candidate doesn't know what they're talking about. So long as you stick to what is in the few words or the phrase or the list after the dash or colon and explain that in your own words, then chances are you're going to get full marks. Now, just a quick reminder that the colon, the dash, falls into sentence structure, which is an umbrella term. Sentence structure is not a technique, so you cannot say the writer uses sentence structure. You must say the writer uses a dash or the writer uses a colon, as you've seen here on this slide here. So nice, simple, straightforward formula to start your answer. The writer uses a dash, the writer uses a colon, and then working on to what comes after those symbols and explaining that in your own words. You will have to look into a larger text to do this, so on the day you'll be given a paragraph or 6 or 7 lines to look into for sentence structure, and you'll have to scan through and see, can you see a dash, can you see a colon? Be careful when you're scanning though, because sometimes you'll see a dash and rush into the writer uses a dash to explain further, blah blah blah, but actually if you look more carefully, later on in the sentence there is a second dash, which would mean it's parenthesis. Okay, so that's it for the dash and the colon. Keep an eye out for it in all the reading that you're doing. Name the colon or dash for 1 mark and explain what comes after the colon or dash for the 2nd mark. And I'll see you in the next video.